Sorry. So today I'm going to be talking about ancient Egypt, and in particular, I'm going to be talking about the Old Kingdom and its rise, fall, and also its peak. So when we think about ancient Egypt, a lot of the times what comes to mind are the pyramids, mummies, the Sphinx, stuff like that. And while I am going to touch on that today, that's not going to be my main focus. I'm mostly going to focus on the other aspects of the society. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at the rise and fall. Um, so, looking at why did that society form where it did, what led it to becoming a politically complex society, and what that society looked like, both for everyday life and for the pharaoh. And then again, I'm going to be looking at the fall of the society. So I'm going to be looking at what led to the downfall of this society. So, looking at stuff we already know about the Old Kingdom of Egypt, we know it lasted from 2613 to 2181 BCE. It was also known as the Age of the Pyramids because this was a time when a lot of the pyramids were, in fact, constructed. And cities were mainly concentrated around the Nile River, and that was mainly because the Sahara Desert lied on either side. So there wasn't really a good place to settle other than the Nile. And that was because of rainfall, water access, and food availability in the Sahara Desert. There would have been limited rainfall. It wouldn't have really been hospitable to live in, so um, people settled along the Nile River instead. And looking at the timeline of ancient Egypt, it's pretty complex. There are numerous time periods, and what we're looking at today starts in the Epipaleolithic around 8800 BC, and it ends with the Potomac Dynasty around 30 BC. This timeline that I have down here is pretty simple, but it was the best one I could find. Um, we see here around 5000 BC, settlement begins in the Nile River, and then around 3000 BC, we see the Old Kingdom begin. Um, So that would have been 2600 BC when it began. Um, so, talking about later Stone Age Egypt, people mainly subsisted on domesticated animals and crops during this time. So, domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, wheat, barley, these would have been like the main food sources that people would have eaten during this time. People were also able to hunt aquatic animals and to grow crops. And also, we see evidence for elaborate burials and long distance trade networks during this time. So, we see a little bit of the inklings of a complex society during the later Stone Age, but that develops more during the pre dynastic period. Um, During the pre-dynastic period, we see agricultural communities become more common. People start farming more. We see more of a food surplus. And this is because of the fertile soils and the floodwaters of the Nile River, which really provided a good place to grow crops and to support animals, especially in the middle of the Sahara. And then looking at one of our archaeological sites, we also during this time see evidence for semi permanent as well as permanent dwellings. And this really marks the shift towards that politically complex society that we'll see later on. All right, so looking at the pharaonic state, it began in 3100 BC with the establishment of the first dynasty. And this is where we first start to see pharaohs take control as a form of government. And these pharaohs would have linked themselves to gods and goddesses um, in an attempt to bolster their power as well as justify their rule. And along that same line, we see them during this time build elaborate tombs. So we see these great pyramids being built, um, which would have required a lot of wealth and power. And we really see how powerful these elites were during this time by looking at the monuments they built. The pyramids themselves would have required thousands of workers to complete. And not only did the pharaoh have to provide the funds to construct such massive feats of architecture, they would also have to house and feed the workers, which would have required an enormous amount of wealth. So we really see the inequality in this society through these architectural constructions. And this pyramid building tradition would continue into the Old Kingdom, and that's where we really see the Great Pyramids being constructed, the ones we normally think about when we think about Egypt. Around 2600 BCE, these constructions were revolutionized, and that means by that I mean that they were created out of stone rather than mud brick. All right, so talking about the Old Kingdom, the Nile was especially important, but it wasn't just important for food and water resources, like I'd stated before. That was one of the key reasons why it was important, but it also facilitated and maintained unification from both the Upper and Lower Egypt. And the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt is really what distinguishes the Old Kingdom from other periods of Egypt, because we do see this unification. Um, so things like internal trade, communication, and sharing and spreading ideology would have been things that the Nile River would have enabled. Looking at trade networks and wealth during the Old Kingdom, um, the government was heavily invested in the control of trade and trade routes. And this control would have been gained through military campaigns and conquest. And through that, we see that this government had a very organized military, and we see the power and bureaucracy that government held. Um, Looking at these trade routes, though, regions such as Nubia were under the control of Egyptian influence, and that was through military campaigns as well. We see the coordinated and complex bureaucracy of the government during this time. And also, we see a lot of specialized jobs during this time. And that's another thing that marks the society as being politically complex. We see people such as scribes, government officials, etc., craftsmen, stuff like that. And this Egyptian administration was funded through taxes, so we also see a tax system during this time, which is really interesting. Talking about religion during the Old Kingdom, that was an especially important aspect of the Old Kingdom because it was an integral part of the state. It wasn't just religion to them, it was actually part of the government because the Pharaoh was seen as divine. We see a large pantheon of gods and goddesses who were worshipped at cult centers. And by cult centers, I mean that each god and goddess would have had their own set of temples and shrines where they would have been worshipped. And these shrines and gods and goddesses would often be associated with animals as well. And in Egyptian religion, we do see an emphasis on the afterlife and their belief in mummification. So, looking at the fall of the Old Kingdom, we're really looking at things like civil war, raids and looters, lagging military technology. Those were some of the reasons why this society came to an end. But also, climate change played a key role. So we see low floods as well as intensive rainfalls, which may have been triggered by the North Atlantic Oscillation. Those would have caused rapid collapse of the Old Kingdom because they would have led to the decline of the agricultural output, which would have resulted in famine, which would have resulted in an undermining of the government authority, which would have weakened the Pharaoh's authority in the Old Kingdom. And that's part of the reason why we see this complex society begin to fall and break apart. And here are all my sources. So that's it.